Well, hello good people. This is hopefully the last part of getting this Pietenpol Ford engine going. Thanks for all the feedback in the last film. Chris in New Zealand, you're a genius. That is now the pivot. That's the slotted bolt, and I can tension the chain far more easily. I was a bit worried it was going to tip the magneto too far towards the block, but it doesn't. So thank you very much. A son of a flying chum of mine recently gave me a 100cc Jap engine, JA press switch, and it's partially seized up. There's nothing too much wrong with it. I've had the head off. Anyway, it's now lurking under the bench and full of oil. I'll get it running at some point. But it had on it this rather nice fuel tank with cap and tap. So it's had a quick clean out, and I put a new spring on the tap and lapped it in with some metal polish and tidied the lid up and everything. I found a 1954 date stamp on it, so that will do very nicely as a fuel tank. The engine is now standing in a cradle, which I made from scraps, and the fuel tank's going to go on that upright you can see. So there's a fuel filter, and the tank goes complete with its bracket that it had to hold the thing on the cylinder head of the Jap engine. We'll go up there, so I've got gravity feed down to the fuel filter and then to the carburettor. This fuel filter came from Bewley Auto Jumble about 20 years ago. It was a sort of 50p job in a box of whatever. It's quite a nice filter, but it was missing the gauze. So I've made a tubular gauze. The fuel goes into the outside, so if there's any muck comes out of that tank, it's got to make its way through the gauze, which just sits on the bottom of the glass bowl. I've made new cork for it as well, so that should stop anything nasty going through to our top quality Chinese knockoff carburettor. I fixed the starting handle as well, having cut off the remains of the old pin. The outer part of the pin I've turned down to about somewhere just over 5/16. I want it to be a really nice fit in the dog so it doesn't slip whilst I'm cranking, but on the other hand it doesn't tie up at all if and when the thing should decide to start. The magneto has been apart on the bench. I've just bolted it back on to try a few things. I thought it was one I'd had on my Ronca Champ, but it turns out it was a spare because I looked through some notes I found in one of my workshop books, and the original magneto went to another chap. Anyway, I think this one works because I managed to give myself a bit of an electric shock with it the other day, but I took it apart anyway. So let's go over to the bench and I'll show you what I did. We also need to fix up some ignition leads. Right, that's the good magneto on the left. This one here is one of the spares that came with the Lycoming engine, which is nearly identical. It's seized up actually, it won't turn at all. The reason I've got it on the bench is I want to show you I had to replace the contact in the end of the drum here on my one. This one seems to have had probably a carbon brush that runs on a wiper on the coil, but there's nothing there at all. In fact, this is all absolutely dreadful and rather worn out. Move that out of the way. My one, I don't think you'll be able to see, it's actually quite difficult to see down in there, had a brass contactor and it was very worn. It runs again on a kind of brass wiper plate down in there. So I replaced the brass contactor with a brass screw, carefully drilling into the remains of the drum, winding in a screw, and that's worked a treat. If you're wondering why I didn't film taking the magneto to pieces, well, it was a desperately frustrating exercise. I should have been able to undo this Allen screw here, and then the shaft would come out. Obviously the coil wasn't there, but I couldn't get that one undone. Nothing would move that. So I had to take these 3 screws out. That wasn't really a problem in itself, but then carefully pushing the gear and the drum off of the bearing was really difficult because they're obviously very soft and they were a tight fit. Likewise, putting it all back together was rather frustrating, and I had to make sure the gear was in the right place and the drum, because although there's 3 screws here, they're not equidistantly spaced. That's for a good reason. You'll notice one of these teeth has got a paint line on it, and that tooth should come up to the centre there as the number 1 contact lines up with the contact to the HT lead. So obviously one has to put all this back together, meshing correctly with the gear below, and amazingly I did get it right first time. The reason it has to mesh correctly with the other gear is that not only does one want that contact to line up with the HT lead, but of course the point should open at the same time. I did actually prove this to myself by using the magneto timer. We'll do that when the magneto goes on the engine shortly. But the reason for the paint line is this. You'll see there's a window on the magneto here. And this is a really nice thing about these mags. I'll try and hold it up and hopefully you can see there's a yellow pointer in the window. Just try and focus the camera as well as I can. You can see the yellow pointer. I'll just back the magneto off, and as that gear, indeed that tooth, gets to that position, the points are just opening. So what it means is you can fit this magneto to an engine where you've already positioned the propeller or the flywheel to the amount of degrees before top dead center that you want the mag to fire on. So I think on an A65, that's about 25, 28 degrees, something like that, before top dead center. It's actually quite a lot. And of course, it's a non-impulse mag as well. But the point is, you don't need to mess around with the buzz box at the moment. You can just line it all up visually and drop the magneto on. And of course, you can then swivel the magneto on these here for your fine adjustment using the buzz box. It is a really good system, but it was quite difficult getting it all back together again. The last sort of thing to point out with this magneto is the firing sequence, which is very badly scribbled by me on the top there. Directional rotation obviously that way. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this is magneto firing sequence, not firing order of the engine, which is 1, 2, 4, 3. Obviously when it comes to putting the leads on, I'm going to go 1, 2, 4, 3, like so. Which there were nice little stickers in there. There's only the number 4 left. I tested the magneto when I'd finished by putting the old contactor in the number 1 position, positioning the drum just before the number 1 HT lead. I stuck a piece of brass rod in there, my hand over the top, and flicked the magneto over sharply with the gear on it, and I gave myself an electric shock. So I think it works, but we're going to find out properly now. A subscriber in California very kindly offered to send me a load of these and the bits to hold them on, which was very kind, but they were not quite what I wanted, and I sort of wanted to mess around making my own thing. So I think in the last part of this wondrous series I showed you the acetal rod and brass rod that I bought to make contactors from, and just like Blue Peter, here's one I made earlier. But there's 4 of these. They're almost identical to the original, but they've got a screw thread on the other end, so I can clamp on a terminal. These brass terminals are easy and cheap, and they're great for fitting on the ends of the leads. I'm having them on each end. Usually they're just used on the spark plug end. Anyway, so I turned up 4 of these things. They look like the kind of things you'd attach to Ted Bundy and then give the blighter a load of AC. Not that he didn't deserve it either. And then the other 2 are longer. I'll show you why in a moment. I wanted all the leads to head off at this angle, and I didn't want them all to meet each other. So the answer was to have 2 short and 2 long. So that should keep all the leads apart. I wanted them pointing backwards and outwards slightly so they miss the oil filler and then come up through 90 degrees and up to the cylinder head. So I think that will work. Well, having fitted all the insulators and bits, I've now taken them all off. This cat's cradle of wires here is to test the magneto. Each of these should arc across to its adjacent wire. I have had a quick mess around. It is sparking, but I thought we'd try it in the dark and run it with an electric drill, the 5/8 socket on there. So let's see what happens. Not quite sure how dark it really needs to be, so let's try it like that with just one shop light on. Well, they're all sparking, so whether I can crank it fast enough Obviously this is usually fitted to an A65, and which is hand started, so it ought to. Only one way to find out, really. Now, another appalling confession to make is that I've already made the ignition leads. I've used these on both ends. These were another set I have. If you're using these solder-on ends, the idea is you strip the wire, poke it down through, and thread it through out of one of these little holes and into the other one. Well, you can do that. I cheat. I put a 16th drill down through there and actually drill down through to the second hole. I then, if I need to, poke a piece of welding wire down there just to make sure it's free. With a stripped off length of lead, I tin the end of the wire on a soldering iron and let it cool. And then I stick the whole lot down there so it's gone through both holes. I've got a whacking great soldering iron, which is brilliant. I just sit the whole terminal on the soldering iron and feed a load of solder down through the holes. It's really quick and easy to do. I made the leads last night because tomorrow is the one good day this week and I'd quite like to get the engine running. I turned the engine round earlier, finished the engine cradle and fitted the flywheel. And the flywheel is set now to top dead centre. It's actually quite easy to find top dead centre. I'll just show you, actually, it doesn't matter messing it up, I can reposition it again, but with the flywheel on, it turns really nicely, no funny noises. And when it had spark plugs in, it also had quite good compression, which probably shows my dodgy head gasket works in some fashion. Anyway, let's reposition the flywheel to top dead centre on the number 1 cylinder and then fit the mag. I've got the valve cover off this side, and so what I want to see is the number 4 cylinder valves where the exhaust valve closes, so it's just opened, and the exhaust valve closes and the inlet valve wants to open, so it's there. So that's my top dead centre mark on the flywheel. That means number 1 cylinder is on the firing stroke. Of course, one of the things to decide is how much to advance to give the magneto. There's 12 bolt holes around the flywheel here that hold the clutch cover on. So obviously between each bolt hole is 30 degrees. Now oddly enough, top dead centre aligns with halfway between these 2 bolt holes. So if I mark a halfway line with my Sharpie in between each bolt hole, certainly the ones that matter, I've got a mark every 15 degrees. Now if this was an overhead valve engine like the A65 or the 0145, it would have about 25 degrees of advance, and they rev to just over, well, maybe the 0145 revs to about 2,500 RPM, and the A65 I think red lines at 2300. Now I'm probably not going to rev this much more than 2000. I want to gear the car to do 60 miles an hour at 2000 RPM. I think that'll be terrifying enough for anyone else who's on the road at the time. Anyway, I'll be having a lovely time. So I reckon 15 degrees is probably about the sort of advance I want. Maybe a little bit more. I don't want it too advanced because of course it might well kick back, and when I first run it I'd prefer it to be a little bit retarded, much like its owner, and then advance it up if necessary, particularly once I've run it a bit and I've got the hang of starting the thing. So I reckon 15 before, so that lines up with that bolt hole there, and I think we can just be kind of a bit gash and use marker pens and bolt holes, would be about right. So I'm going to put the flywheel there, just make sure I'm going in the right direction. Yes, I am, against the starting handle, not with it. So that's about 15 degrees before top dead centre on the number 1 cylinder. The magneto is positioned correctly. The little white tooth is showing against the pointer. And oddly enough, that makes the key upright. So I reckon what I should do is try and thread the chain over the sprocket and see where the nearest position is to having it upright. That's it. That's better. Key there, I don't know whether you can see it, looks about upright. It's absolutely freezing cold in there. I had the doors open earlier for about half an hour whilst I was swapping the engine round. and it snowed like you wouldn't believe. It's all melted, but it's just freezing cold and horrible. So everything's cold to the touch. Right, so the idea now is mag on there through the hole, so, and sprocket on there, I suppose, if we can without dropping it. I'll replace these nuts with nylocks in a while, but not until everything's in the right place. Right, let's tension the chain up. Yeah, that's about the right place there, I think. Let's do the nut up on the sprocket. Now if I move the flywheel backwards and forwards, yep, there's our tooth coming into view. So with that, that's not bad at all. Get the magneto timing tool. We'll see how well that's worked. Now these magneto timing tools are marvellous things. You can't really time a mag nicely without one. They're not expensive. Had this for years. It weighs nothing. You can sort of join the Llewellyn bag on long trips. The nice thing is, all it needs to be is earthed, and take this off for a moment. This green is for the, traditionally obviously for the starboard mag, but it doesn't really matter. You've got a green for the starboard, red for the port. I'll just clip the green one on because it came to hand first. But it just needs to go on the magneto earthing lead, the P lead, which is rather splendid. And effectively, if I turn the engine in the direction of rotation, when the point's open, the light should go out. I remind myself, lights go out and the beeper will sound. So the points are opening there, and obviously it's a really accurate way of seeing. Now oddly enough, that is so close to my mark here, it's maybe 16 degrees advance instead of 15, but I only used bolt holes anyway. I think I'm just going to accept that as being fine. Now, rotating it with the direction of rotation, I'm as sort of retarded on the magneto as I can be. I might need a little more advance, I doubt it. I reckon 16 or 17 degrees will do fine. If it kicks back tomorrow, then I guess move this round one tooth and then time it again. Obviously means I've got a bit more rotation adjustment with the mag, but I'm going to live with that for now. If you're really eagle-eyed, you might have spotted that and that. And if they look like turned down pieces of log with a copper pipe epoxied in, stuck into the water fitting, probably with tiger seal, because there's a slight taper turned on them, you'd be completely correct. This is the water in, that's the water out. I've got a stainless steel central heating tank, came from a Rayburn indirect system some years ago, and that's basically going to sit on a step ladder next to the engine, and if it boils up it can shove water out the top into the tank, and obviously when it shoves water out the top it'll feed a bit more in the bottom and stop it running dry. It's gloriously Flintstones. What did you expect? It's all up together with fuel in the tank. I've rigged up this very rudimentary throttle. I haven't turned the fuel on yet. That's the oil return line. After I switched the camera off last night, I stuck the side panel on there with Tiger Seal, so it should be nice and oil tight. I'm inclined just to try it, see if we can get a chuff out of it before I fit the water system, because I'm not 100% convinced that that magneto is giving enough spark. It can run for a few seconds without water in. That's not going to do any damage at all. And if it does start, well, I can turn it off, fit the water system, we can run it for much longer. Anyway, let's see what happens. Petrol on, the bowl's filling up. I don't know too much about settings on the carburettor, so I've just set the idle mixture a little way out. Of course, it's got that adjustable main jet as well, so we'll have to see. If fuel starts peeing everywhere, then I guess I turn it all off. I've only used this clear plastic pipe because I had some, and well, it's quite nice to see the fuel running through it. Sort of thing you'd use on your Suffolk Punch lawnmower or something nice and English like that. A bit of fuel dripping from the bowl. That might be me just not doing it up tight enough. But I think that's exactly what it is. So no fuel appearing there, which is a good sign. Let's go choke closed. Throttle closed. There's actually kind of hot burning smell around here, which can only be fuel burning. Choke. I removed the automatic choking bit because I didn't really like it. I'm actually going to just stick a rag in it, and if it starts, I'll pull it out quickly. It has actually fired a few times. Now I need to back the magneto off, so I need to come round one way that way. So, as it turns that way, so we're backing it off. Bolt out the way. Okay, so the chain's still on. Chain off. One tooth back. Chain on. That was the sound of success. The best bit, whether you noticed it at all, is the bypass started working. So there's actually clean oil now sitting in the pipe here, running down to the pan. I can just see it slowly making its way through. It's a big fitting, it's got a sort of half-inch hole, so there must be quite a lot of oil in the pan. Anyway, when it went, it went. That magneto timing was obviously too far advanced. I can probably advance it up a little bit because it was easy to start like that. Didn't want to kick back at all, so I might advance it 2 or 3 degrees because I think that would be better. You saw how it idled. That was wonderful. They do get warm fairly quickly. I'm going to give it half an hour to cool down. I'm going to go and get the workmate, put the water tank on, and then we can have a longer engine run. Anyway, that was absolutely splendid. Who remembers the workmate? Like so many things in my life, this one came out of a skip. Dodgy pipe work on. It's still quite hot, so I'm just going to top the fuel up and check the oil whilst it's cooling down. In fact, I'm going to stick a bucket of hot water in it from the house, rather than sticking cold water in the reasonably hot cast iron engine. That would be a bit foolish. So I think a plastic bucket full of hot water. Might as well fill this right up, and to make sure I run it for long enough that my neighbour notices. I can always get the disc cutter out if I think I'm still not making enough noise. Well, wasn't that exciting? Unfortunately, my homemade head gasket, I think, has blown. It's actually fine on compression, but it's leaking water from the waterways. It has emulsified the oil slightly. I've drained the oil. Doesn't matter, it's not a disaster. Anyway, when I made that solid copper head gasket, a comment was that, did I try Belcher Engineering for an original old stock one? Well, I tried them, they're up in Norfolk. And for not very much money, we've got this lovely original new old stock Model AF head gasket. So that's going on instead. The winners were the Magneto. I'm really pleased with this arrangement. I'm not quite sure on the timing yet. It's very easy to start now. It's probably too retarded. I think I can bring it up to another 3 or 4 degrees of advance, maybe up to 10 degrees. I think it was too aggressive before. I think it was about 16 or 17 degrees, which was just enough to kick it back. I'm going to sort a few things out on it. I'm actually really pleased with the whole thing. I'm going to try and get as much oil out of it, so I'm going to tip it over in a moment off camera so the dipper pan drains into the sump a bit more and I can get as much oil out as possible. The Chinese carburetor, well, that worked all right. The fuel filter was great. This little Jap fuel tank's a delight. I shall use that for engine runs on other things. I can't see any oil leaks. The emulsified oil isn't all over the dipstick or anything. It didn't sort of get a huge amount of oil in it, but I just want to not have condensation in the engine at all. I don't think that's a good thing, so I might as well just ventilate it and get all the oil out. After I finished filming, I hoisted the engine up on the crane and took the oil pump out, which meant I could just mop the bottom of the sump out, but the oil had drained properly anyway. There was none of that emulsified muck in there at all. So the oil pump's back in and it's full of clean oil, and it's noticeable now how easy it is to turn. I know it hasn't got a cylinder head on, but it was a lot stiffer before with the honing. And of course the bearings were all put together with STP, which on a cold day is even thicker than Lieutenant George. So it's no wonder it was a bit of a swine to turn. Anyway, it's really easy now, and with the clean oil in, which I've wound it over for several minutes, so the oil's gone through the system nicely. It just needs its cylinder head back on. With the head on the bench, we can get a few clues as to where the leaks were. You can see these witness marks around here. The water seemed to leak from these holes towards the combustion chamber, and unfortunately I think it was aided and abetted by my squidging holes that I put in here in good intent, but I don't think they actually helped at all. Of course, I put this gasket on dry, and were I to use it again, and if I didn't have another option I would, then I would anneal it, I would pickle it in citric acid, which is what a very nice gentleman commented about actually when I made the gasket. He was quite right. It's a food grade acid. You can get citric acid. I bought some off Amazon for not very much money at all, and I will experiment with it another day. And having cleaned it with citric acid and not scrubbed it at all with Scotch-Brite, which I think would have given a better surface, I would give it a jolly good blasting of Permatex copper spray and then stick it on. But of course I made this because I didn't have the option at the time, so I thought of buying a new old stock or new gasket. And I didn't want to commission one because I've had issues with commissioned gaskets in the past due to template issues that I covered previously. However, the gasket Belcher sent me, beautiful though it is, and it fits, I believe is early Ford V8. The stud architecture is correct, but this is all wrong, and all the waterways are wrong as well. So, good people at Belcher's, I sent them an email and they replied within hours asking for photographs, which I sent them straight away, and same day they put this in the post, which was brilliant. So thank you, Belcher Engineering. They're in Norfolk, they're in Diss, and thoroughly recommended just from that one experience. So all that's left to do with the Pietenpol engine is to fit this new gasket, and then next month we'll take it outside, give it an engine run, and have a wash up of the project. I hope it doesn't leak. Thank you for watching.